I'm honored and delighted to introduce Professor Rebecca Wanzo, who I've known and admired and learned from for some time. She's professor and chair of women's gender and sexuality studies and affiliate professor of American culture studies at Washington University in St. Louis. And her many previous accomplishments include the study, The Suffering Will Not Be Televised, African American Women and Sentimental Political Storytelling, which was published in 2009, and essays on a wide range of topics on film, literature, and popular culture that appear in major academic journals as well as many public media outlets. I'm especially impressed, though I have to say, that some of her critical work has appeared in the back pages of comic books, including the brilliant comic book series Bitch Planet and Bitter Root. I'm deeply impressed by someone whose CV lists major academic journals as well as comic books as the sources for their critical work. However, her recent book, which I'll do a little show and tell if people can see, her recent book, the content are a caricature, African American Comic Art and Political Belonging, which was published by NYU Press in 2020, is simply put, a game changer. But don't just take my word for it. It has received 3 major awards: the 2021 Will Eisner Comic Industry Award for Best Academic Scholarly Work, the 2021 Charles Hatfield Prize from the Comic Studies Society, and the 2021 Catherine Singer Kovash Book Award from the Society for Cinema and Media Studies. The latter, the first work on comics, and I'm guessing perhaps the first on non-moving images that has been so honored by that organization. It has also received an honorable mention for the 2021 Harry Shaw and Katrina Hazard-Donald Award for Outstanding Work in African American Popular Culture Studies, given by the Popular Culture Association. I have to ask, just honorable mention? What were they thinking? Let me translate this trifecta for those who may not know the relatively recent academic realm of comic studies. She won an Oscar, Emmy, and Grammy in the same year. This widespread acknowledgement is for a study that is not only, as expected, smart and well-written and compellingly argued, but for a book that took real nerve, analyzing African-American reappropriations in comics of what are inarguably racist stereotypes for possible redeployment as critical commentary. Professor Wanzo effectively disallows the easy but intellectually lazy knee-jerk condemnation of stereotypes, originally a neutral term from printing, as obviously bad or negative in all of their appearances. Among other accomplishments, she assembles a rich historical archive of comic books, graphic novels, newspaper strips, editorial cartoons, which are relatively neglected in comic studies, as well as a stunning chapter on underground comics, a field that I once argued, attention to race has been a blind spot. Not now, with her study. These works by African American artists, and as she notes, almost all men, often make the audacious, risky attempt to employ racist imagery to challenge racism. If you haven't read the book, here's a teaser. She concludes with a discussion of the film Black Panther, and unlike many commentators, I'm being snarky here, on the wildly popular film, she actually knows the comics that it derives from. Is it progressive or conservative? Does it use positive or negative representations? Her answer, spoiler alert, is yes, it does. Or perhaps, no, it does not. In this instance, but more broadly, something I've learned to expect from Professor Wanzo is that I don't know what to expect. When she takes on artifacts of popular culture, the analyses are unusual, fresh, new, original. She's especially attuned to their subtlety and contradictions and the telling details that may undermine a general sweeping opinion. She refuses the easy take, or what she refers to as the critical flattening of a work summarized too quickly or too bluntly. As she summarizes, quoting Professor Wanzo, binaries of positive and negative or good and bad often have limited analytical value in tracking the complex work of racially problematic representations. Nor does it explain why African Americans can be interested in rehabilitating them. The rehabilitation of Black representations is foundational to African American cultural production, so much so that we must understand the shadow of Black racial caricature as haunting all African American representations," unquote. Again, I find such claims bold and bracing in a book that demands powerful rethinking and repositioning. I anticipate that in her presentation today, Professor Wanzo will again make such demands of us. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rebecca Wanzo.
Well, that was really the most lovely and generous introduction I've ever had. So I don't think I can possibly live up to all of that. But I really want to thank Corey, who I obviously have learned from and cited and have taught for this invitation, as well as Anna and Teresa and everyone who pulled this together. I'd first like to acknowledge that my talk in this event takes place on the homelands of the Chippewa, the Iowa, the Kickapoo, the Menominee, the Miami, the Missouri, the Omaha, the Osage, the Oto, the Ottawa, the Ponca, the Potawatomi, the Sac and Fox, the 3 affiliated tribes, the Winnebago nations. So I just want to give that land acknowledgement and just say how honored I am to be in this company. And I need to say that I am taking advantage of being amongst my people, comics people here, and just all the other kinds of disciplinary training that people bring here, to present a work in progress. I really welcome help, so it's less polished than the brilliant presentations that came before. So I just wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to think through some things. This is part of what I'm now coming to realize is a group of essays that may come together or may not about the relationship between high art and comics by people of color. There are various times where people have done this work, but race seems to be absent from it in various ways. I should say that unlike Stacy, who commented yesterday, I was unable to capitalize on the pandemic. I was stagnant. I don't know what's more stationary than a sloth, but whatever that was probably me. It was my work. My work stayed on the back burner, and it tends to in general. I sit and think about things for 10 years. My last book took 10 years. My first book took 10 years. I'm a slow thinker. So it's been sitting for a couple of years. When I first drafted in 2020, and I pick it up periodically and do something with it. I've taught my favorite thing is monsters a couple of times, and been working through it. So when I think about the work that's taken place about museums and comics, comic art and high art, and then race, like once I applied for a panel and said, oh, this seems, someone said was really great, but we don't know how it's fit. And it seemed to me it sort of didn't fit because it was about Blackness, and also about editorial cartoons, which is another one of the things I just always wave, like, let's not leave that out of comic studies and comics and cartoon art. And years ago, I published a piece about Kerry James Marshall's Rhythm Master. I don't know how many people are familiar with that work. And I have an essay forthcoming in Kiana Whitted's collection in African American comics in the first half of the 20th century about prominent African American artists like Romare Bearden, who Stacy mentioned yesterday, who started off as a cartoonist for the Black press. So there are a lot of prominent African American high artists who were working in doing editorial cartoons, and those are often not included in discussions of their work or even archived. So I'm trying to think about how these things work together, but I've also been thinking about how my favorite thing as monsters should be the kind of gateway text that Fun Home was for a lot of literary scholars. So there's a way in which, people had read Mouse and maybe a few other things, but Fun Home was the book that sort of made it respectable for English professors to do work on comics, because there are all these references. So all of a sudden, I know a number of colleagues were like, oh, have you read Fun Home? And then they're all, the Ruskin and all these things, like they felt like they could talk about comics. And so I think that this could be that text, and it's not just because of the citational practice. of Ferris's graphic novel, which lends itself to art historians taking it seriously, but because it's also about how people look at things that are understood as high art and various other visual media, and it complicates some of the more censorious scripts about identification and the relationship between people of color and museums and traditions, visual art traditions that are supposedly not for them, as well as how we think about this in an intersectional way in relationship to women and sexuality. So I also want to say that all day yesterday I was contemplating the theme of this project, which is about reckoning, and whether or not what I'm doing with this project is thinking about reckoning, or how reckoning worked in my previous work. So on the one hand, it's certainly true that in the logic of the comics I often discuss, reckoning plays a role in the sense that characters often have to reckon, or people have to reckon with other gazes, how they're treated. They have to reckon with racism. They call people to account for racism. The creators are calling people account to racism. But then there's also the Southern colloquial, which for me then is the Black colloquial, which is I reckon, which is often a challenge to someone else's claim or counterclaim. So if my use of racial and also gendered and queer reckoning is at play here, it's a kind of slow, seductive challenge to what people feel is true about how the racial and gendered gaze and objectification works. So, from almost the moment Laura Mulvey's Visual Pleasure of Narrative Cinema was published, critics explained all the ways in which the structural account she gives of the apparatus does not accommodate resistant readings of the viewer or alternative structural accounts of how films formally work. It is a somewhat curious critical genealogy of an idea that is both easily challenged for essentialism and continually influential. I sometimes feel the phrase, the male gaze, trips off my students and many of my colleagues' tongues more easily than almost any other concept, although I think neoliberalism might be an up-and-comer, but I digress. Many feminists remain committed to the formalist nexus established by this foundational essay, that the gender of the viewer, the gender presentation of the body being gazed upon, and the form and medium can be mutually constitutive in crafting discourses about gender, sexuality, and power. And because on that account, Mulvey was clearly onto something. I mean, there's a way in which we look at things, and it's hard to say that objectification does not take place and that there is not a gaze that is patriarchal and is regulating women. However, the idea of a white gaze as a hegemonic force seems to me less of an issue of critical contention, although I'd love to discuss that and argue about that. Although there are similar critiques of essentialism in what brown, black, indigenous, and Asian people see when they look, and what counts as racialized objectification is still deeply debated despite frequent claims about the transparency of a racist representation. And I think the difference lies, with exceptions like the work of many feminists of color on pornography like Jen Nash, Murray Miller-Young, Celine Shimizu, is in the question of pleasure. And one of the reasons Mulvey's argument was so quickly contested was because many feminists recognized how it did not account for their own pleasure when they were watching Hollywood films. And some of the same things rejected to in the male gaze are constitutive of the pleasure people take in the representation, whereas with racist representation, it's often more the case that people work through or around the representation to find pleasure. But there's also this third rail here of pleasure, in which pleasure and identification is found without the explicit engagement with identity. In other words, we know that we take pleasure in things that have nothing to do with identity markers, even though it is the case that there are lots of examples of people saying they don't want anything to do with something if it does not have something to do with their identities. Like, we do experience it. I had a student once saying, like, well, if they're not queer people in this film, I don't want to watch it. I was like, okay. So I was trying to figure out how to teach this class. So I was like, all right, so that's a commitment. That said, it does not mean identity does not play a role in inhabiting something because of your identity. It simply means it does not have to be a direct referent or a metaphor for your identity. So I will come back to that. So all three kinds of pleasure are found in the treatment of the gaze in relation to various media in My Favorite Thing is Monsters, Emile Ferris's critically acclaimed 2017 graphic novel. My Favorite Thing is Monsters has two stories embedded in one, with 10-year-old Karen Reyes' journal providing the framing for both. Karen is a young queer Chicana who describes her life with her mother and older brother in 1968. At the beginning, we discover their neighbor, Holocaust survivor Anka Silverberg, was found shot dead in her apartment. Anka's story is the secondary tale about her experience as a prostitute in the Weimar Republic. The text thus moves between three kinds of horror stories: Karen's consumption of fictive horror narratives and Anka's traumatic tale of her experiences during the war, as well as Karen's own story as precarious queer child of color coming of age in the 1960s, in which she depicts herself as a werewolf. Karen, as reader, listener, viewer, and artist, is a meditation on the race and gendered instability of the gaze and its object. In other work, I've made a case for integrating African American cartoonists more prominently in scholarship about the history of Black aesthetics, and I want to make a case here for art historians seeking out comic art that speaks to important questions in the field. And again, I'm thinking about Fun Home being this gateway text. I think My Favorite Thing is Monsters has this visual complexity and engagement with the high art tradition that can make comics more acceptable to scholars who see comics as unsophisticated. So there are ways in which I'm trying to target possibly eventually an art history journal for this piece. And so in the time I have today, I want to discuss how My Favorite Thing is Monsters addresses some of the primary themes in feminist art: the gaze, the female grotesque, feminist revision and remix, bodily transgression, and gender performance, and to think about how these explorations are integrated with questions of race in identification and the place of people of color as consumers of high art and museum spaces as well. So, make sure I can move this along. Maybe I can't. All right, there we go. So Ferris should be read in relation to a long history of feminist underground comics that began in the United States with It Ain't Me, Babe in 1970. It was followed by other comics such as Tits and Clits and the long-running underground comic women's comics. The British one-shot Heroine, the 9-issue run of the French comic Nana. While the only contributor among these cartoonists that I've seen that Ferris has specifically claimed as an influence is Linda Barry, common themes in feminist alternative comics, such as the aesthetic of journaling and a feminist treatment of women's bodies as abject and grotesque, and detailing interiority of girls and women, is central to her work's aesthetic. I should say that I don't experience race as being a prominent theme in these comics, so that's also so important to know in the complicated way in which underground or alternative comics, which they became, developed. So Linda Barry, and so look at the layering and the journal aesthetic here. It's sort of has the doodle, and I think the texture of My Favorite Thing is Monsters is really key. You also can see here with like Phoebe Glockner, Aline Kaminsky, that emphasizing objection, and so to think about those themes as a genealogy. And there's this long theme in these works of reworking or remixing Americana. So Ferris's focus on horror films and comics from the 30s, 40s, and 50s really speaks to that tradition in those works. So a foundational textual referent is the universal horror film, The Wolfman, released in 1941. Anybody seen that? Only like some people. I'm actually very fond. This might be my favorite universal horror film. But and Lon Chaney's Larry Talbot returns home to his estranged father and is bitten by a werewolf when saving a woman from attack. Cursed, Larry is doomed by primal desires to hurt others and eventually is killed by his father. This rhyme like, even the man who is pure of heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright. You should catch it. You should watch it. So Unlucky Larry is a sympathetic character, but also representative of the pleasures women might take in looking at monsters. Linda Williams argues that to look at the monster might be a woman's recognition of their similar status as potent threats to vulnerable power. The destruction of the monsters generates the frequent sympathy of the women characters, who seem to sense the extent to which the monster's death is an exorcism of the power of their own sexuality. In the classic horror film, the woman's look at the monster offers at least a potentially subversive recognition of the power and potency of non-phallic sexuality, precisely because this look is so threatening to male power, is violently punished. And The Werewolf has been a site for exploring feminist sexual coming of age before, perhaps most famously with the Canadian cult horror film Ginger Snaps. In that film, a strong young woman coming into her sexuality made the werewolf metaphor work, seeing an affinity between narratives of hormonal changes attached to women and menstruation and werewolves who cannot control their own bodies. The 1941 version of The Wolfman is also very much about race. Larry becomes contaminated by the blood of a werewolf, who is also Romany, and then becomes in between in the way that Karen feels racially and sexually in between. For Karen, her queerness and racial difference intersect with girlhood on the border, creating the affinity with the monster. The graphic novel opens with the 10-year-old protagonist suggesting monstrous identification. The chapter heading is a full page evoking mid-20th century horror comics with a depiction of a werewolf on the cover. A hand turns up the volume on a record player with Trog's The Wild Thing on the turnstile, so that the narrator tells us she can hide what she was doing. With a full moon above a murky cityscape, the text box tells readers it would have completely sucked if Mama had come in and found me doing it. But I started moaning real loud, like Dee's when he used to have his boyish dreams. The text obviously suggests masturbation, but when we see her and her hand, she is not doing what we assumed. She has transformed into a werewolf. She fights a mob before seemingly returning with her werewolf face and girl's clothing to her bedroom to draw in her journal. This representation of child sexuality and trauma in childhood was also part of the transgressive content of early underground feminist comics. Phoebe Glockner obviously is well known, but also here's a couple special issues focusing on girls, little girls from women's comics and on Anna. But I do want to mark the difference between texts that depict normative development of sexuality versus ones that depict abuse. That recognition and development of child sexuality can be a normal form of development, and influenced by our encounters with media is often explored in accounts of queer childhoods. And I think the idea of normativity is really interesting here. Like, what does it mean to understand this as werewolf narrative as perhaps a normative narrative? Like, what if this is a normative narrative of desire that we are watching, right, or reading about in this text? So another reading is Racial Persecution, and the scene evokes the lynch mob, foreshadowing the Frankenstein representation later in the comic with one of her friends that also blends persecution because of race and queerness. The panels actually reference a really famous work. Do you know what's referenced here? Yes, so. Right? So Ferris revises the painting's subjects, making them an ominous representation in rural America, which may have been what they always were to some. American Gothic has generated endless play, coming to signify authentic rural subjects in ways good may not have intended, to bring a mechanism for tweaking Americanness and domesticity. In the frame, but not central to it, Ferris decenters this representation by making it one of many references that shape Karen's fantastical understanding of herself in the world, making high art and this most well-known representation of authentic whiteness, or is it, part of how she is seen. This introduction establishes a framework for reading Ferris's 400-page opus that is still not complete. The 10-year-old protagonist is constantly drawn as a werewolf, so her interior vision and desire for herself is how the readers see her. It marks a difference in what the graphic narrative form can do, making her vision of herself how we see her, as opposed to an occasional textual reminder that moves in and out of our imaginations. The first-person voice of many girls' coming-of-age novels is often most powerfully rendered through the form of the diary or the journal, with non-fictional and fictional texts such as Anne Frank, Diary of a Young Girl, the complicated way in which we understand Girl Ask Alice and its authenticity, that said, but Speak, occupying places in the young adult canon. But like Linda Berry's Cruddy, and I think there's a lot of affinity with Cruddy here with this text, both in terms of identity, and I think that we have Susan Kirtley's work on Linda Berry helps us think about maybe what the differences might be between these texts, and I'm happy to talk about more about that later. Ferris's monster represents a gendered grotesque and raced and engendered objection that embraces the idea that there is something to be found in what Barbara Creed has termed the monstrous feminine. The visual encourages us to value the uncomfortable image as opposed to desiring that the protagonist find a way past it. Monstrosity is an ethical mode, and my favorite thing is monsters, creating the conditions for sympathy. Girls' interiority in the journal, as Bonnie J. Morris argues, is often depicted in a larger canon of journals as a private confessional, less concerned with the public sphere, or if it is, rendered through domestic, intimate encounters as opposed to philosophical treatments appropriate for the public sphere. Rendered through a graphic journal form, Ferris treats the girls' journal as a commentary on cultural texts that shape the imaginary, both high art forms, like works found in art museums, and low art forms, like the horror comics, horror film, and EC Comics representations, arguably not designed with her as the ideal reader or viewer. By demonstrating her counter-reading practices and interpretive practices, signified most consistently with identification with monstrosity, Ferris's protagonist explores the role of interpretation and resistant reading and performance practices in making a queer Chicana girlhood. My favorite thing is Monsters could almost be seen as a text that provides a different map for an abject child experiencing in-betweenness and monstrosity she feels within and sees outside of herself. And again, to think about Linda Berry's Cruddy, and who's read Cruddy? There's a few people. It's so worth reading, and I think I'm not even sure how in print it is anymore, but in that text, the protagonist, Roberta, or anti-hero Roberta, has experienced extensive trauma and is a picture of objection that has also engaged with this idea of monstrosity. And Kirtley describes this distorted, hyperbolic perception of girlhood in that text. And for Kirtley, the problem for Roberta is her identity is mediated through these various funhouse mirrors, and it's shaped by others, this kind of grotesque rendering and understanding of herself. And she sees that part of what sort of dooms her is that she doesn't have a creative outlet. So if we think about that text in relationship to this, Cruddy leads its protagonist, I'll just not spoil it, since very few people have read, not to the best end. Whereas Karen's reading practices are possibly a politics or practice of survival. So Karen's counter-reading practices are seen through her recreation of these horror characters, crafting these kind of EC like horror comics, and recreating well-known works of art with a difference. In all of these cases, we see the complexity of the gaze. So she's not the only feminist cartoonist to recreate commercial, like Western commercial and Western artist. If you have not read Lost Girls, people like, which was Melinda Gebbie is the artist, and people always talk about it as Moore's Lost Girls, but Gebbie's art is so essential to that text, which technically speaking, I guess that there's another piece I wrote about Lost Girls. It was an American literature that does really think about Melinda Gebbie and this work in the tradition of alternative comics and how her art practice is so essential. And so it's reimagining the tales of Alice in Wonderland, Wendy Peter Pan, Dorothy Wizard of Oz, and these stories of child sexual abuse and the erotic, specifically the erotic between women as a curative to these kinds of traumas. And people like Aubrey Beardsley and other kinds of, and then commercial art are depicted all throughout this text. So much of this text explores how Karen interprets visual culture. Many of the images she recreates or imagines are of monsters appearing threatening to young white women with the erotic and threat colliding. Over the course of the text, Karen depicts herself as replicating an erotic binary in which monstrosity is the opposite and constant shadow partner to white femininity. Because, her objects of desire are very white, ethereal, pale in this text. And so such copying is a means of processing her budding queer desires. Now, the Art Institute of Chicago is one of her favorite places, and the image of the joy she and her brother experienced there, with her brother more transparently non-white to others, I think it challenges the idea of who can feel at home. Framing the museum as not for someone like Karen or Dees can come from multiple directions, not only from the people who do not imagine people of color as patrons, but through interpretations of what omnipresent whiteness at the museum must mean for people of color seeking to find pleasure and transformative experiences there. So to be clear, I'm not trying to cast My Favorite Thing is Monsters as a defense of the absence of people of color in museums. I'm only speaking to the ways in which Ferris destabilizes, which can be sometimes some feminist and anti-racist framings of identification. So for example, let's look at her revision of St. George and the Dragon, roughly created 1434, 1435, by Bernat Monterel. This is a Gothic painting, and obviously the Gothic is a major theme, and My Favorite Thing is Monsters. But note that Ferris changes the title from St. George and the Dragon to St. George Killing the Dragon. So you can see it, it's sort of hard to see, but you look here, you have these, so she puts the titles often on the sides. And it's one of the subtle changes Ferris often makes to these works that call attention to what matters to her as a viewer. And I say that, I mean, there's some really great work on this text, but it hasn't had as many close readings of the artwork and the revisions itself, which is one of the primary things I'm trying to focus on in this work. And so we also have the subtle revision of the triangular theory of composition of art here. Dees went to art school. He tells her what that is. And so the triangular theory of composition adds depth. It calls attention to action. It produces harmony in Western art, right? Here, Karen embraces the theory, but by seeing Dees as all three figures, so you see him with St. George, the dragon, and the princess being rescued. So here are just a couple of sort of examples, but Karen sort of sees, creates or crafts Dees' face into here, but also there's another frame where beneath this where he's also St. George, and then shows a version of him that is also a monster. So Karen's embracing this theory of triangulation that is about harmony, but also something else, right? She's just seeing it. She's just willfully seeing that he can be everything, and to understand is that the ethos of how she's approaching all of these works. There's also, let me just go back, but there's a frame in which Karen remembers or imagines herself crawling into the cave, because what we'll see throughout the text is her going into the artworks, and there's another version of Dees curled up in a ball that the dragon is protecting. So this ability to embody, inhabit, and be protected by visual media, these are not all the same thing. It's a recurrent theme in this text. So it demonstrates what Jose Esteban Munoz has called disidentification, when people find themselves both within and in resistance to text, taking the form here in feminist, queer, girl of colors, appropriation of it. But here, and this is something I'd really like to talk about, I wonder if we miss something if disidentification is understood as wholly accommodating Ferris's text and Karen's practices. Because there's a way in which there's almost no outside of these texts for Karen's. She always understands herself as having entire access to them. They are hers as much as they are anyone else's. So her brother Dees takes her to the Detroit Museum of Art, where she sees Henry Fuseli's 1781 oil painting, The Nightmare. So here is Ferris's reproduction of the painting. So she describes the swooning lady in the painting like on romance covers, that kind of intertextual reading that she often does. So she doesn't like the romance novel covers that her mother reads, right? Those are texts she doesn't feel like she has access to, probably because they're too heteronormative. But The monastery creature looks way groovier, she says, and more intelligent and more respectful than the beefy idiots ripping the ladies' sheets on the romance covers. Karen's indictment of representations of normative heterosexual desire is a means for Karen to explore how her non-normativity, if it is indeed non-normative, and I do think, again, there's an argument to be made that this is a text that's constructing this as normative desire, normative childhood development, can be present in a canonical imagination. She states that her brother found it sexy. Deeza's desires are both a point of alienation and affinity. The monstrous as the real threat is also displaced in Karen's reading as the woman reminds her of Anka, a Holocaust survivor who we've been introduced earlier in the text. And she sees the demon as a problem, but that there's something from her past that's torturing her, right? So there's a different relationship she has to the demon here. So Karen makes this distinction between good and bad monsters, and you'll notice, that there's, and you see this sometimes with the monsters, there's something sympathetic, the eyes look different. He's almost cute, I think. And then the cuteness comes back, so if you just, again, sort of looking there, there's a slight shift, I think, in this revision. Karen makes a distinction between good and bad monsters. Again, the bad clearly marked the real horrors that pepper the text. Through a reading of the Blessed Guillaume de Luz, Tortured by Demons, she makes this distinction. Explicitly, she sees the murders of Martin Luther King Jr. and John F. Kennedy as examples of monsters attacking them who don't want anyone to be free. They want the world to look the way they want it to. They need people to be afraid. Good monsters, she suggests, sometimes give somebody a fright because they're weird-looking and fangy, a fact that is beyond their control. But bad monsters are all about control. They want the whole world to be scared. So we can extrapolate that horrors in the text, there we go, here's her version, like the white supremacist violence that scarred her friend's face and the Nazi regime or other controlling monsters. And this moment is an example of the common narrative convention of the child's gaze on white supremacy, which we've seen many examples of across media, ostensibly destabilizing it with the child's moral logic. So Karen's fandom of horror comics, monster films, and art is an interpretive mechanism. And for a long time, fandom as a tool for philosophy was sort of considered a child's practice, less, comics for kids, all these things. And as opposed to adults who've moved on to proper adult attachments. But now I think that with the mainstreaming of fandom, this sort of popular text as a way of philosophizing is like an everyday practice. Like you'll see a piece in the New York Times that's like theorizing politics through, a Marvel film, right? So the slippage between the coming of age text is always an adult text, which Jacqueline Rose has argued of children's literature, brings Karen's multifocal interpretive practices in which high and low offer different versions of monster theory to the readers, helps us understand how the popular is more acceptable now as a way of theorizing everyday life. And placing these texts in conversation as a way to destabilize the binary, but also just reflect how people may encounter the world. So my favorite thing is Monsters is a text that takes hybridity seriously on absolutely every level. Karen clearly sees herself as a good monster, and in her reading of horror films, the kind of film often understood as having a unilateral male gaze and female object, and this is something obviously complicated by scholars like Carol Clover. She is a sympathetic monster figure made a monstrosity by her queer desire. She uses a horror film imagination to depict her relationship with her crush, Missy, a friend who, under pressure from her mother, abandons Karen and begins hanging out with a group of mean girls. Ferris depicts the two in sleeping bags during a sleepover, holding hands, the vulnerability of Karen as a werewolf, a young werewolf in love, of course, the soft smile suggesting a young lesbian werewolf in love, destabilizing the construction of the monster as threat. One night they watched Dracula, for whom Missy fell hard. Later that evening, they cut their fingers, a traditional childhood rite of passage containing an erotic charge after they watched the vampire movie. Missy swoons, like Dracula's pale, vulnerable victims. Karen, Missy explains, is so brave. As Missy lies overcome after the mingling of their blood, again, she's this very small, frail, thin, blonde attachments. Karen kisses her hand, and Missy whispers in sleep her love for Karen. Missy's mother keeps them apart shortly after that night, and Karen's crush begins being cruel to her in a cabal of elementary-age she-devils. But Karen cannot return the affect, no matter how mean Missy is. She writes, "I can't be mean back. Her blood is inside me." The average travails of girl friendships is layered by young queer desire, which is also everyday, albeit rarely so explicitly in fiction about 10-year-olds. And overlaid by her mournful monstrosity, she is the movie monster whose love is not returned. But unlike most movie monsters Karen grew up watching, she gets the girl, albeit briefly. They reconcile, with Missy professing that she only feels herself when she is with Karen. Karen depicts herself as much larger, unclothed, as an unclothed monster, while Missy, now is also larger, has long canines, transformed into a monster as well. In the logic of the monster film and queer fantasies, perhaps both homophobic and homoerotic, she's been infected by Karen. That Molly's mother and others would read the relationship as unnatural, while we as readers are in sympathy with Karen's desires and find the relationship as sweet, is by now a convention of modern queer childhood narratives that align the gaze of the reader with the gaze of the protagonist, resisting casting their readings as non-normative. The queer readings can transform not only who we see, but who we are, is emphasized after Karen's brother reads her journal, and he forces her to look at her reflection and see herself as a girl. And my students are often very angry about this moment, like why he's doing this to her. The page which leads up to Dee's forcing her to look at her reflection, significantly, is one of the most traditional 4-panel structures in the comic, right? So for the most part, this text lets go of traditional grid structures. But here, when she's depicted as just this little girl, right before that, it's a traditional structure of framing, right? So I'm thinking back to Fred's discussion of the pause yesterday and what that does. So it cages her, it contains her, and it takes away her control, right? So she's then revealed on a full page to be conventionally cute before she's immediately a werewolf again, as she challenges Dees with his words to her that people should get to be who they are, not who people tell them are. Ferris depicts Karen as cute, and cuteness is a site of objection for her. Karen remains a werewolf for the rest of the narrative, willing into being what she sees, able to fight off other people's vision of her construction of self. Karen's desire to be a monster tweaks the kind of angst about being and appearing different in many popular coming-of-age tales in which the child is told that adulthood will eradicate the conditions that produce her otherness. In these fictions, one day, mom, dad, teacher, cool adult says, the world will see you and appreciate you. But Karen, of course, is young queer Chicana in 1968, and while we can imagine a future for her when it does to follow contemporary inspirational discourse for queer youth, get better, the attentiveness to state violence destabilizes the individual inspirational account of maturity, reducing alienation as inevitability. A principal sign of future vulnerability is Franklin, a gender nonconforming Black youth who experienced racial violence in the South and fled to Chicago. The injuries are still marked on his face. Ferris draws him as a Frankenstein monster, and I should say there's a long history of like the Black Frankenstein, and actually a lot of Black cartoonists have done this as well. Karen draws Franklin within artworks as well, and if you look at, we see what he says perhaps when they're in the museum together, and readers are getting commentary that depict his pleasure and his gaze, but it seems less of an ownership, and again, this is just coming through Karen, of the works as his own, but how he's interpreting them. But he still does have access to them, although he seems to have access that's different than Karen's. And we do know also from the text that she doesn't quite grasp the struggles that he experiences as a queer Black boy. And Karen and Franklin's vulnerabilities are not the same, but Ferris does draw connections between the intersectionality of race, ethnicity, gender, and queerness, and how it makes people vulnerable to violence. Dees is concerned that being out will make Karen vulnerable to sexual violence, and their multiple vulnerability to neighborhood bullies both Franklin's, who was attacked in the South, and also how he's vulnerable in Chicago. Karen, how she's vulnerable. Anka's experience as a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust. They all speak to this nexus. And Anka's story is this tragic example of adulthood's failure to be an effective counter to the alienation and injuries of childhood, sold into prostitution, and later suffering as a Jewish girl under the Nazi regime. We know that she escapes these horrors, but is still haunted. She also experiences queer intimacy with another young prostitute, one of the rare sites of solace in her young life. So again, how queer intimacy is assault against ethnic racial terror. But Anka is physically and psychologically scarred by her youth, and we sense that her alienation never went away. Blending of childhood desire and injury with state violence makes Karen's choice of monstrosity seem to give an account for her difference, but give her more power than a 10-year-old girl. Monstrosity is a means of affinity and ethical understanding of alienation produced by structural violence, but also a way of self-presentation that decreases her own vulnerability or sense of vulnerability. The drawn monster's performance of interiority that she feels and desires, displacing the helplessness of the queer Shekinah girl. Even as Karen knows the monstrosity tends not to end well for the monster in the fiction she consumes, the lack of futurity for the monster is preferable to her own perilous futurity, a precarity that becomes more pronounced when her mother dies at the end of the text. In Mourning, Karen is on the run, and Ferris depicts her attempt to escape her grief as moving through various landscape paintings. Here's George Ennis's A Marine. And then I want to return to the question here of what pleasure looks like with text in which identity does not have to be present. That women are often considered of nature or allegorically nature, that people of color are often configured as of nature as well, is a common framework for understanding the relationship between identity and landscape. But here, landscape is what she feels and how she may lose herself and where she may find herself. So scholars such as the poet and literary scholar Evie Shockley have explored what it means for African-American poets to be nature poets in a critical landscape that often struggles to make sense of where blackness is an abstraction or work about the natural world. But here, I think this is an example of not a creator, but an interpreter and consumer of the landscape painting where identity plays a role because it is a way for her to be elsewhere without there having to be a specific referent. So my favorite thing is Monsters performs through the monstrous protagonist a resistance to popular ways of looking at this queer girlhood of color. Monstrosity is a protective shell that allows Karen the fantasy that she cannot be touched and not be known, even if it is a means of intimacy with others. That we know her deeply but cannot see her, or that we see her the way she wishes to be seen, represents a fantasy of control for girls of color that is perhaps just as fantastic as the most supernatural monster fiction, but is a fantastic that demonstrates the identificatory and pleasure possibilities that still, to this day, are often foreclosed. Thank you.
We have time for questions, and actually, since I delayed us starting a little, I'm going to allow us. Oh, I don't think I turned it on. Oh, but I was going to say for questions, because we're recording and streaming, we need people to take the mic, please.
I think, yeah. Really awesome. Thanks, Rebecca. And my question is, how do you read the tattoo art of Diego? And also, I felt like Dee's somehow not only taking her to the museum, but a kind of that deep, sensitive connection between the two was really important in this, if we want to call it a formation narrative or Bildung. But I wanted to hear, I would love to hear some more about Diego and Karen and Latinidad maybe with the tattoos.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so again, that speaks to specific cultural practices, right? In terms like there is his body art and how he's covering his body with these, with these women, like, because he's a troubled character, right? They're troubled characters. His relationship between women, his approach to intimacy, but then we see this bond of intimacy that he has, with his child, not his child, but actually he becomes her caregiver, right? So he's a second parent. And I think that one of the things to look at with this text, which is complicated, they seem to be cut off from, in thinking about Latin Dada, like a broader community, right? That they are isolated because the father was what might have been the point of connection, right? So there is an isolation there. And so then there could be a question about what it means to read them in relationship to some cultural traditions that they're foreclosed from, but that also doesn't eliminate how they're read. He may be more visibly of color, so he's read in this way, but then everyone knows people know her parentage, and then her father is absent, so there is a sort of discourse about who they are in Chicago in this space. And so I think that Dees is, he also has this broad range of aesthetic practices. The tattoo art, as an artist, as a consumer at the museum, that he's, his bodily modification, his way of talking about art, like he is articulating a way for her to be able to also claim everything. And he claims, like I think the way he treats women, that's a way of claiming claiming women visually that's also troubling in its own way. But he also, I think, has encouraged her to understand everything as possible for possession in relationship to identification with himself that blends sexual desire and aesthetic pleasure, right? Yeah.
This isn't a question so much as an announcement. If there's anybody here that hasn't read My Favorite Thing is Monsters, because you can't afford it or you missed it when it first came out, the Iowa City Public Library does have copies. As well as you mentioned, like Linda Barry's Cruddy, the Iowa City Public Library has a copy. Check it out.
That's good. Everyone should read it and maybe buy it. Give her some money.
Thank you for an absolutely fascinating presentation. I have a question that might be of interest, particularly in relation to the interrogation of theories around identification, particularly as they emerge out of a type of 1970s apparatus theory. And it has to do with one of the most fascinating points in your paper, which was so rich, in which we see the frame in which she's returning the gaze. Now, I haven't read the work, so I don't know if it's the first time we get that return of the gaze and it has this real power of rupture or not, and so I'd love to learn more about if we see her before that or after. But part of why it interests me so much, particularly in regards to the larger theoretical interrogation that you're setting up with the work, has to do with the fact that, in a lot of film and visual culture work in the past few decades, particularly with regard to attempts to reclaim representations of racial others, say, for example, in early cinema, representations of African Americans, for example, there's been a lot of hyper-celebration of moments in early cinema where the objectified, racialised other returns the gaze. And it often gets read as this moment of hyper-agency, a moment where the objectified is claiming subjectivity, there's an ethical relationship with the contemporary viewer, etc., really common trope. But here, if I'm understanding it correctly, and this is why it really interests me, and I'm immediately going to go and borrow and read, is I think something different is happening in the way she's mobilising it. But again, maybe I'm misreading, but what I'm understanding from the way in which you presented it is here, the rupture is actually traumatic. It's not one in which she's...
This frame?
Yeah, I'm not sure though. So I'd like to hear more from you, because here, the rupture is coming from, again, I'm just trying to understand it, is it coming from the fact that for the first time, what has previously been her subjective world is now switched to the objective, and that for her is not something she wants to connect with. And so there's a different type of trauma going on there, rather than the simple repeat of how the return of the gaze often gets mobilised in recent work around reclamation of racially objectified representation.
I mean, yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, not to go too far down a Lacanian path, but I mean, the thing about the mirror stage and the gaze, right, is that like that is understood as a traumatic moment. Like there is this moment where you recognize, you see, there is a self that is not you, right? There's like you're somehow, you recognize that this phase of development, that there is this other that is you and not you, right? And then you're having to negotiate that in relationship to sort of triangulated structure of the ego and the id and the superego. And so here, you know, she is forced. It's not like a natural that she'd been developing. Then her brother's trying to force her to see this. And I think the relationship between the idea of the subjective and objective is a complicated one. It's like, so this is the real, right? That he is forcing her to see in the psychoanalytic framework. How do we think about the relationship between the real and the symbolic here? Because he's trying to force her to be on a frame, like to go along on a train of development that he thinks is more appropriate for her to sort of be able to manage in relationship to her fantasies. And so I think so to your question in terms of how we think about this in the rest of film theory, because a lot of this is about subjected others. Yeah, my goodness. Subjected others looking, like the whole text is her returning the gaze. The whole text is that. So this is one actually where he's looking at her. Like this is actually a moment, even though there is a reflection, you're seeing a look that he's trying to force her to be an object in a way that she has not chosen to be. So this is actually the reverse, in the sense that the whole text, we're seeing her looking. Like we're just getting her looking because it's her journal. And here it's like him, we are actually getting some version of a male heteronormative gaze, not to make her, but trying to make her a normal object. And that there is a refusal there, and I think the resistance is that we have been seeing the whole time her gazing. And then we're learning about how you can gaze at text and objects and see them differently, because that is actually everyday practice. And that's what people of color often do. That's what queer people do. Like they are doing that all the time.
There's time for more questions.
Anything else?
So in the scene where Karen and Missy are hugging, you talked about how now that Missy is a monster, it's kind of like an infection. But I was wondering if, since how Karen is now a larger werewolf monster and now Missy is kind of like a beautiful vampire, like taller, seductive, almost in a way that like most vampires are depicted in media, if it could also be interpreted as maybe just before, during the sleepover, maybe there wasn't any past experiences for Missy, and so now it's more or less she is just now coming into being a monster, whereas now Karen sees herself as a bigger monster and is maybe struggling with coming out rather than an infection, since they aren't the same type of monster after the situation of them being together.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And my answer to these is almost always both and, which might seem like a sort of way out. I mean, I think, because if you think about the werewolf, where there was also blood, and you think about Dracula, and there's also blood, and then you think about discursive queerness, which are also infection, like just it's so everyday, this idea that if you're exposed to teachers or other queer, like my daughter isn't really queer. It's like she's infected by this other, by her friend, right? Like that she's been corrupted, right? So I think that it is, particularly given the theme of blood, and they make it explicit, to keep that. But I do think you're right in speaking to, they are of a different type, right? She's not the same. That Missy is probably, she's going to be sort of still maybe trying to be at home in some ways that Karen can't pass. She's excessively other in ways that Missy still maybe isn't. And so we are supposed to see them as different, and we are supposed to see this as an awakening for her. But there's still this idea of contamination or contagion that isn't, again, not a bad thing. Like it's not a bad thing. It's a transformative thing. And I think it's the pleasure. It's like, again, making possible something normative and pleasurable, but something's often pathologized.
Hi, Rebecca. So good to see you. This was wonderful. Thank you so much. I have one of those, like, it reminds me of comments, and then an actual question. So I'm one of those who has not read and viewed this work, but I was thinking a lot of James Baldwin, Go Tell It on the Mountain, and Tony Cade Bambara, Gorilla My Love, as forms of, like, kind of creative spectatorship of films and remixing. And then sort of my questions, yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit more about kind of the importance of, you've touched on this a couple times, but Chicago in 1968 in particular in this work, and you know, I'm thinking of Franklin as a really interesting character, and if I'm thinking as, say, Michael Awkward might want me to think, I'd be curious about possible connections with Emmett Till. I think that specter is there, and it's a sort of interesting reversal, especially with the focus on the face. And then my last question, which you can choose. I love this foray into art history for you, and so I just wondered if you're thinking of that more as something of an object that you have to think as an art historian because of the objects that you're reading, or if there's something kind of more methodological that you're taking from thinking about how this work fits into the discipline of art history.
Okay.
So
I'm going to combine the first two and say, in thinking about Chicago and then with Emmett Till and Franklin, that it is really important. So yes, he's moved from the South after his attack to Chicago, and I think it also. I mean, I think that and Ferris has been sort of explicit about living in Chicago and thinking about the neighbor and that space and neighbors and neighborhood and people she talked to. There's this point where she talked about. Like knowing a Holocaust survivor, but also thinking about configurations of neighborhoods and how people relate to each other. So, I mean, I think it's a text that is calling attention to both tight-knit neighborhoods, ethnic neighborhoods or enclaves, and also segregation. And so how to understand how this family sits in relationships. Again, their mother is white. She's not in a space that might be more protective. And they are, and obviously it's Chicago 1968, all the things that happened nationally in this particular configuration. King was there, the Poor People's Campaign and things and what's going on with housing, not successful in terms of trying to make certain kinds of transformations. It's really a powder keg in a lot of ways. So he comes to this space, Franklin comes here to be less vulnerable, but he still faces a lot of vulnerability in this space. And to think about Chicago, because we still don't know what happened to Anka, like it's a space where they're all experiencing a lot of vulnerability. And so this question about where are you safe as these kinds of subjects, these kinds of queer subjects or of color, Holocaust survivors, or all the kinds of ways that's like a sexual violence survivors, where are you safe? And where can you be safe in your home? And I think this text is a lot about safety, like what makes people safe and how can people become safe. And so with art history, I mean, I feel like I mean, my last book, I mean, there is a lot that is aesthetic theory in that book. And I have, you know, and for a number of years I've taught about Black visual culture for some time and thinking about things together. And I, you know, for a long time I have long resisted certain kinds of binaries that mean that you can't think about certain kinds of visual media together. And what I love, I mean, I love so many things about My Favorite Thing is Monsters, but it's such a brilliant model of how, so maybe just disserto and poaching or various other ways, how people just read in intermediate ways, like people read intertextually. And it models that so brilliantly. And I actually had an art historian this last time I taught it come to, I bought her a copy, and I had her read this, and I had her come and talk about her way of looking at the text. Like I might say, well, when I read, she's like, I don't say read, I say interpretation. Like, you know, there's this real resistance to certain kinds of language. And she was talking to me about how she saw things, and she was just so fascinated because she knows the Art Institute of Chicago so well. She knows the work so well. And she's like, well, and see, this is, like, she immediately recognized the faces and various things in various frames. And she was just really, and she was just struggling though too, I think, to see like, well, and I think my students do, there's so much going on in this text. How do we look at this? You know, what does it help us access? How do we think, or how do we interpret when we look at it? So I do, and I spend, you know, there's a reason I'm spending with a lot of film criticism with this, because this is a text that is highly influenced by, again, I think these horror films, but also theories of the gaze and theories of looking are so prominent there, but also in art history. And thinking there's some version of this where I also talk about the female nude a little bit more in Linda Need's work, that I am often trying to get my students to think about what are the practices of interpretation. I often have, some of my classes are cross-listed with art history, and I want people to think methodologically about how you can use similar tools across disciplines. And, you know, and so I think that there's some that work more with each other. I think art history and film studies, like they are in conversation with each other. Comics is interesting in that I do feel like, I would just like to say, it's not that there are no art historians that do some work with comics, there are, and obviously there are older versions, and you know, there are people who work on Hogarth and they'll do certain things, but I do think that some German work from the early 20th century, you see it in these various places, but I do think that there are practices and ways of reading and really interesting ways of looking and knowing that are the questions that people are asking in art history. And, you know, and particularly in feminist art history, I think it's all over this text. And so I think that it, methodologically, to think about how we're just better critics if we're doing that cross-disciplinary pollination in terms of citational practice and thinking is really what I want people to go for.
Is there someone back there?
No, is that?
Okay, really quick. It's like I love everything that you guys have just brought up, and one of the big things whenever I teach my Intro to Comic Studies is, even though it's housed in the English department, is precisely the moment of Dee's taking Karen into the museum, which is to take my students on a journey of acquiring the visual literacy that will enrich deeply the kind of understanding and meaning making and how it works on an emotion and cognitive level in comics that English departments kind of, you know, when approaching comics tend not to do. And so what I love about yours is in content and in form, it's inviting maybe primarily, and then even more so, inviting the Dees and Karens of the world to kind of step into that space of how the visuals operate as a language just as importantly as the verbal elements of the shaping of the story.
Yeah, and living in St. Louis, one thing that's been so interesting to me is the museums are free. like special collection, like special exhibits you have to pay for, but I have never lived someplace or gone somewhere where I see so many Black people and Black children in museums, in the art museum, and that's because it's free and accessible, and it's a wonderful thing. We have 3 art museums, 2, like the Pulitzer and the Contemporary Art Museum, and then the St. Louis Art Museum, and I see Black people all the time because it is free. And then I like to think, I just feel like the people feel like they have more access there, like they feel like it's also their place. And then I think there's just all this like tumult, which I do follow somewhat in the art world about like, oh, diversification, which they should, like, I mean, the pipeline and who are curators, like, it is just shameful. But there are all these kids, I think, that are falling in love, and like just, that there's just this idea that it just obviously won't be a place for them because of what's there. And I just think that's just really missing how people are sometimes inhabiting those spaces because of essentialist understandings of how they move about in the world.
Wonderful. It's been a wonderful morning. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you.